My parents kept breaking into my apartment, so I moved without telling them and let them panic. The throw pillows were wrong. I stood in my doorway, keys still in hand, staring at my couch. The navy blue pillow that I always kept on the left was now on the right. The cream one with tassels sat where the navy should be. It wasn't a robbery. A thief wouldn't have left my $180 luxury serum uncapped and half empty on the bathroom vanity. This was specific. This was familiar. The emergency key I'd handed over for safety had become a weapon of casual invasion. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I stood there, calculating the probability of a coincidence. 0. This was a pattern deviation I should have flagged months ago. I looked at the spot on the kitchen counter where the spare key usually sat when they visited. It wasn't there. That key was supposed to be a failsafe, a piece of metal reserved for catastrophes. Instead, it had become a master pass to my life. I replayed the data from the day I moved in. I had hesitated then, holding that key in my palm, feeling the cold brass bite into my skin. I didn't want to give it to her. I wanted my perimeter secure. But Angela, my mother, had launched her standard emotional offensive. She didn't ask, she spiraled. What if there's a fire, Evangeline? What if you slip in the shower and nobody knows for days? Do you want us to find you like that? It was a masterclass in weaponized anxiety. She framed her demand for access as a concern for my survival. And I, operating on 26 years of faulty programming, handed it over. That is the trap of normalized intrusion. When you grow up in a house where closed doors are treated as insults and boundaries are viewed as acts of war, you lose the ability to distinguish between affection and surveillance. You are trained to believe that love looks like a lack of privacy. I gave her the key because my internal logic dictated that autonomy was a form of betrayal. I thought I was buying peace. I was actually signing a lease on my own subjugation. The intrusion started as microtransactions. Small enough to be dismissed as helpful, annoying enough to register as a glitch. First, it was the improvements. I would come home to find a beige throw blanket draped over my charcoal sofa because my taste was too sterile. My carefully organized bookshelf would be rearranged by color instead of subject. Then came the unsolicited supply drops. Tupperware containers of food I didn't eat, left on my counter like passive-aggressive offerings. When I called to ask her to please text before dropping by, Angela didn't apologize. She pivoted. She accused me of being manic about my space. "You're acting unstable, Evie," she said, her voice dripping with that faux clinical concern. "Is work too much for you? You get so rigid when you're stressed. We're just trying to help you survive." She turned my request for basic respect into a diagnosis of my mental state. It was efficient. It forced me to defend my sanity instead of my boundaries. I stopped complaining. I absorbed the data, adjusted my baseline for discomfort, and convinced myself it was manageable. I treated their presence like a software bug. I couldn't patch annoying, but not critical. But looking at my bathroom vanity, at the uncapped serum that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, I realized my error. I hadn't been managing a bug. I had been ignoring a virus. And now, the infection rate was exponential. I walked into my apartment at 2:15 on a Tuesday. I wasn't supposed to be there. My schedule was a fixed variable in their calculations. I left at 7. I returned at 7. But a server outage at the firm had sent us all home early, disrupting the algorithm my family relied on. The first thing I registered wasn't the noise, but the light. A blinding, artificial halo stand light was set up in the middle of my living room, aimed at my floor-to-ceiling windows to capture the skyline view. Standing in front of it was my younger sister, Zoe. She was filming a Get Ready With Me video for her 40,000 followers. She was wearing my vintage silk kimono, the one I kept in a garment bag at the back of my closet, and she was applying my moisturizer to her legs like it was cheap lotion. I stood in the entryway, my bag sliding from my shoulder to the floor. The sound didn't register over the upbeat pop music blasting from a Bluetooth speaker. I watched as Zoe struck a pose, pouting at her phone camera. "So, guys, the lighting in this place is literally insane," she said to her digital audience. My sister is never here, so I basically run the place. She wasn't lying. She did run the place. I walked further in, and the scope of the invasion expanded. In my kitchen, my mother, Angela, was plating sandwiches on my good china. My father, Thomas, was pouring iced tea for my Aunt Linda, who was sitting at my breakfast bar as if she were a regular patron at a diner. They were hosting a luncheon. In my home, on a Tuesday. "Evangeline?" Angela chirped when she finally saw me. She didn't look guilty, she looked annoyed, like a hostess whose event had been crashed by the help. "You're home early. We weren't expecting you until dinner. Why is Zoe wearing my clothes?" My voice was flat. I felt a cold pressure building behind my eyes, the physical manifestation of rage. Zoe glanced up from her phone, looking bored. "Relax, Evie. Mom said it was fine, you never wear it anyway. It was just sitting there gathering dust. I'm giving it exposure." Exposure. As if my personal property was a brand asset she was generously promoting. "Take it off," I said. "And get out." The room went silent. Aunt Linda looked at her sandwich uncomfortably. My father set down the pitcher of tea with a heavy thud. "Don't be rude, Evangeline," he warned, his voice dropping into that familiar register of disappointment. "We're having a family lunch. Zoe is just having some fun. You're being uptight." "This isn't your house," I said, looking at each of them. "You don't get to host parties here. You don't get to raid my closet." Angela sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel, my dish towel. "We are family, Evangeline. We don't need invitations. You have all this space. All this view. And you hoard it like a miser. We're just putting it to good use." That was the thesis statement of their entire worldview. My success was a resource they were entitled to harvest. My boundaries were just obstacles to their comfort. I looked at Zoe, who was already typing on her phone, likely posting about her toxic sister ruining the vibe. I looked at my parents, who were looking at me with a mixture of pity and irritation. They didn't see a person standing there. They saw a glitch in their free venue. I didn't scream. I didn't throw them out physically. I realized in that moment that eviction was impossible because they didn't believe they were guests. They believed they were owners. "Enjoy your lunch," I said. I turned around and walked into my bedroom, closing the door. I didn't lock it. Locks were a challenge to them. Instead, I started cleaning up the mess Zoe had left on my vanity. My hands were steady. The anger had crystallized into something useful. They thought I was retreating. I wasn't. I was recalculating. I waited until the elevator doors slid shut, sealing my family into the descent, before I walked back into the kitchen. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a crime scene after the tape has been put up. I started wiping down the granite island, erasing the rings of condensation left by my father's iced tea pitcher. I was scrubbing a smudge of Zoe's foundation off the counter when a chime cut through the quiet. It wasn't my phone. It was my mother's iPad, sitting propped up against my fruit bowl. She had forgotten it again. This was a feature, not a bug. Angela treated my home like an extension of her purse, a place where she could leave things and expect them to be guarded. The screen lit up with a text preview. The sender was Aunt Linda. The message read, "Are you sure Evangeline won't mind? 3 months is a long time for a house guest." I stopped scrubbing. My internal risk assessment software flagged the anomaly immediately. House guest? I hadn't agreed to a house guest. I hadn't even agreed to a lunch. I swiped the screen. I knew the passcode. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Angela's security protocols were as lax as her boundaries. I opened the message thread and scrolled up, reading the data log of my own dispossession. They weren't talking about a weekend visit. They were discussing my cousin, Connor. Apparently, Connor had secured an unpaid internship in downtown Seattle for the summer, starting in 2 weeks. He needed housing. And according to the text thread, Angela had already solved that logistical problem. "Don't worry about rent." My mother had typed at 10:42 a.m. while sitting in my kitchen eating a sandwich I paid for. "Evie has that second bedroom she never uses. It's just sitting there. Connor can take it. She makes plenty of money. She won't miss the extra utilities." I scrolled down. Linda expressed hesitation. "Should we ask her first?" Angela's response was the kill shot. No. If we ask, she'll get uptight and say no. We'll bring Connor to Sunday dinner next week and surprise her. If he's standing right there with his bags, she can't turn family away. She's too polite for that. I stared at the glowing screen. The physiological response, elevated heart rate, heat in the face, tried to manifest. But I suppressed it. This wasn't a family dynamic anymore. This was a hostile corporate takeover. They weren't just invading my space, they were subletting it. They had looked at my sanctuary, calculated its square footage, and determined it was an underutilized asset that they had the right to allocate. They were weaponizing my own social conditioning against me, banking on the fact that I would be too embarrassed to evict a relative once he was physically inside my perimeter. It was a solid strategy. Against the old Evangeline, it would have worked. I would have folded. I would have let Connor stay, absorbed the cost, and seethed in silence for 90 days while my sanctuary became a dormitory. But they were operating on outdated firmware. I carefully wiped my fingerprints off the iPad screen and set it back exactly where I found it, tilted at the precise 45-degree angle. I didn't delete the thread. I didn't smash the device. I didn't call Angela to scream. Data is power, and I now possessed all of it. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. The rain was starting to streak the glass, blurring the lights of Seattle. I checked the date on my watch. Connor was arriving in 14 days. That was my timeline. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to negotiate. Negotiation implies that the other party has a valid claim to the asset. They didn't. I pulled up my banking app. I checked my liquidity. Then I opened a new browser tab and typed in a search query I had been toying with for months, but never executed. Apartments for lease, immediate occupancy, high security. I wasn't just going to move, I was going to execute a phantom exit. I would leave the shell of my life here for them to find. Let them bring Connor. Let them bring his bags. Let them unlock the door to their free hotel and find out that the management had not only quit, she had liquidated the building. I sat down at my laptop. The anger was gone, replaced by the cool, humming efficiency of a processor running a complex algorithm. The decision was made. The execution phase had begun. I didn't look for another glass tower. I didn't want a view. I wanted a vault. I found it in a converted bank building in Pioneer Square. It didn't have floor-to-ceiling windows or a rooftop pool. It had 2-foot-thick masonry walls, a fingerprint entry lobby, and a freight elevator that required a fob to even call. It was a fortress, disguised as a residence. The leasing agent, a man named Marcus who spoke in bullet points, tried to upsell me on the community atmosphere. I cut him off. I don't want community. I want anonymity. If someone comes to the desk asking for me, what is your protocol? We don't have a desk, Miss Thorne, he said. We have a security scanner. If they don't have a fob, they don't get past the vestibule. I'll take it. I signed the lease that afternoon. The rent was $2,400 a month. Combined with my current lease, which I had no intention of breaking early, my housing costs effectively doubled. I didn't flinch. I viewed the extra expense not as rent, but as a security retainer. I was paying for the luxury of a decoy. The migration began immediately, but it had to be invisible. I couldn't hire movers. A moving truck is a billboard that screams departure, and my parents had eyes everywhere. Neighbors, the doorman, maybe even driving by just to check. I had to become a smuggler in my own life. I bought a large, nondescript gym bag. Every morning, I packed it with the essentials: tax returns, birth certificate, external hard drives, my grandmother's jewelry. Every evening, I took the bag to the fortress, unloaded it, and returned to the glass cage with it empty. It was a slow, methodical extraction of my identity. For 2 weeks, I lived in a hollow shell. To the casual observer, my mother, who still dropped by unannounced twice to measure the windows for curtains I hadn't asked for the apartment, looked normal. The furniture was there. The clothes were hanging in the closet. But if she had looked closely, she would have noticed the density was gone. The file cabinet was empty. The jewelry box was just a prop. The winter coats in the back of the closet were missing. But Angela didn't look closely. She never did. She only saw the surface, the stage she was setting for Connor. I played my part in the charade perfectly. When Angela texted me about the upcoming Sunday dinner, the ambush date, I replied with a thumbs up emoji. When Zoe sent me a link to a cute duvet cover she thought Connor would like for the guest room, I didn't block her. I replied, "Send me the link." I was feeding them data to confirm their bias. They thought I was compliant. They thought the acquisition was complete. On the Wednesday before Connor's arrival, I scheduled the final purge. I hired a junk removal service for a midnight clear-out. I told them I wanted everything gone. The sofa, the bed, the dining table. I wasn't moving it. I was liquidating it. Furniture is heavy. Freedom is light. I sat in the middle of my living room floor on that last night in the glass cage. My voice echoed against the bare walls. I checked my phone. One new message from my father. "Make sure you stock the fridge. Connor likes IPAs." I didn't reply. I simply archived the message into a folder labeled Evidence. The trap was set. The bait was the apartment itself, and they were sprinting toward it with their mouths open. The algorithm executed at exactly 5 o'clock on Friday. I was sitting in my new living room, a space enclosed by 2 feet of reinforced concrete and a deadlock that required a biometric scan to open. My phone sat on the coffee table, screen facing up, silenced. I didn't need to be at the glass cage to see what was happening. I had run the simulation in my head 1,000 times. I knew the variables. I knew the players. At 5:01 p.m., they would be parking in the guest loading zone, a violation. I knew the concierge Michael hated. My father, Thomas, would be unloading Connor's heavy suitcases, playing the role of the magnanimous uncle. Angela would be ushering Connor toward the elevator, likely telling him how lucky he was to have such a supportive family, how generous they were to arrange this for him. At 5:05 p.m., they would reach the door. Angela would reach into her purse for the spare key, the one she had bullied out of me, the one she had fought to keep. She would feel a surge of satisfaction as she slid it into the lock. She was the matriarch. She held the keys to the kingdom. At 5:06 p.m., the door would open. I took a sip of water. My heart rate was steady at 68 beats per minute. At 5:07 p.m., my phone screen lit up. It started with a single text from Zoe. Where is your couch?" Then, the avalanche. The screen became a blur of notifications. Incoming call, Mom. Incoming call, Dad. Incoming call, Zoe. A barrage of texts that arrived so fast they stacked on top of each other, vibrating the table like a trapped insect. "Evangeline, pick up. This isn't funny. Where is the furniture? Connor is standing right here. Pick up the phone." I watched the light dance across the ceiling. I didn't touch the device. I imagined the scene playing out across town. They had walked into a void. No sofa to sit on. No bed for Connor. No internet router. No food in the fridge. Just the echoing silence of an open floor plan that I had scrubbed clean of my existence. They weren't just inconvenienced, they were exposed. They had promised Connor a luxury internship experience. They had boasted to Aunt Linda about their ability to provide. Now, they were standing in an empty box, with a confused 20-year-old and his luggage, looking like liars. At 5:15 p.m., a voicemail notification popped up. I let it transcribe. It was Angela. "Evangeline, I don't know what kind of sick game you are playing, but you need to get here right now. We have guests. There is nowhere to sit. The power is off. Fix this, immediately." The power wasn't off. I had just unscrewed the bulbs in the hallway to make it dim. But the panic in her voice was real. It was the sound of someone whose reality had just shattered. She couldn't compute that I wasn't there to fix it. She couldn't process that her key worked on the lock, but not on me. At 5:20 p.m., the final variable fell into place. An email notification from the leasing office of my old building. Subject: Noise complaint. Unauthorized entry. I opened it calmly. "Miss Thorne, we have received complaints of shouting in your unit. Security reports several individuals attempting to move luggage in without a reservation. Please advise." I typed my reply with steady fingers. "I am not on the premises. I have vacated the unit. Those individuals do not have my permission to be there. Please handle according to building protocol. Send." I visualized the security guard, a man named David, who had zero patience for influencers or entitlement, riding the elevator up. I imagined him asking them to leave. I imagined my father trying to bluster, trying to use his "I'm the father" voice, only to be told that he was trespassing. They would have to drag Connor's heavy suitcases back down to the lobby. They would have to load them back into the car, in front of the watching residents. They would have to explain to Connor why there was no room for him. The humiliation would be absolute. I turned my phone over, screen down. The vibration stopped, the connection was severed. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I wasn't their resource. I was a ghost. The silence in the fortress wasn't empty, it was structural. It felt thick, like a weighted blanket pressing down on my shoulders, forcing them to drop for the first time in 26 years. I sat in the armchair by the window, a glass of wine in my hand, watching the notifications stack up on my silenced phone screen. Angela called. Thomas called. Zoe text. I hate you. Angela voicemail. Please, just tell us you're safe. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't feel the old spike of cortisol, the conditioned reflex to soothe their anxiety. I just watched the light blink, detached and observant. This is the peace of the sovereign. It isn't just the absence of noise. It is the absence of the threat of noise. It is the visceral, physical realization that the door is locked, the walls are thick, and no matter how hard they pound, they cannot get in. My nervous system, which had been running on a high-alert background program since childhood, finally spun down. I wasn't lonely, I was fortified. I waited until the notifications slowed, until the initial burst of panic had burned itself out. Then, I picked up the phone. I didn't open their messages. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I opened a new message thread, added them all, and typed the terms of engagement. I have relocated. I am safe. I will not be sharing my new address. Do not attempt to find me. Do not contact my workplace. If you do, I will cease all communication permanently. If you want to see me, we will meet in a public place, once a month, at a time I choose. These terms are non-negotiable. Send. I blocked the immediate replies. I didn't need their feedback on my boundaries. I took a sip of wine and looked out at the city lights. I knew what they were saying right now. They were telling each other, and anyone who would listen, that they were worried sick. They were painting me as the unstable daughter who vanished, the cruel child who abandoned her family. But I finally understood the code behind their language. Worry is often just a disguise for control. When they demanded a key in case of fire, they weren't afraid I would burn. They were afraid I would lock them out. When they panicked because I didn't answer a text in 10 minutes, it wasn't love, it was a perimeter check. They weren't grieving the loss of my company tonight. They were grieving the loss of their access. They were panicking because the asset had removed itself from the ledger, and they didn't know how to function without it. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I wasn't a resource to be harvested, or a space to be occupied. I was a sovereign state with my own borders, my own laws, and for the first time, my own keys. I turned off the phone completely, and set it on the table. The screen went black, the room was quiet. I took a breath, and it went all the way to the bottom of my lungs. If you've ever had to change the locks on your own life just to breathe, share this story. You never know who needs the courage to disappear today.